So, on this weekend, after going through the tanks and the healers, it's time to go through the DPS, and we are starting for today with the Melee DPS. So, much like we have done for the tanks and the healers, this is an important question because we are now less than a month away from the release of Season 2, so many players are starting to wonder what class, what spec am I going to play for the next season, who is looking good, which changes are going to be given to the specs that might or might not change their state, their power level before the next season. So for today we're going to try to gauge what is the situation for the Melee DPS. Now, much like the tanks and the healers, there are a couple of important things to keep track of when looking at how the situation might be for the next season. Number one is their current power, of course, how powerful they are right now. Number two is their tier set. So what kind of power they are going to be getting from the tier set. And then number three is what kind of power might they be given or might they have taken away from them by Blizzard in the balance tuning that will come in patch 10.1. Unlike, as a surprise, unlike what we checked for tanks and healers, we actually do have some balance tuning coming the way of the Melee DPS for patch 10.1, because Enhancement Shaman is getting some positive overall changes to their talent tree. Those are not massive, but they're going to be netting out to be a buff for enhancement. What is a bit more lengthy and a bit more difficult to gauge is the changes, which are quite significant, to Feral Druid. Feral Druid is bound to receive quite a few changes in patch 10.1. They are getting a redesign to Berserk. They are getting more damage shifted to their generators. Generators like Shred, like Thrash, like Swipe, like Brutal Slash, all getting damage increases, as well as a much more powerful Lunar Inspiration and Moonfire damage for Feral. So that's a significant enough change for Feral that might modify their current state in the next patch. But the more important change, which will be hitting all of the specs, is of course the tier sets. Now, much like the healers and unlike the tanks, the DPS for Melee are also quite different in terms of their power between Mythic Plus and the raid. If a spec is powerful in the raid, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are also very powerful, that they are also meta in Mythic Plus. For example, this is currently, towards the end of this season, the tier list, the rankings for Mythic Plus, where we see specs like Subtlety, specs like Havoc, Demon Hunter, and Enhancement being the most brought and the most popular specs at the very high level of keys, followed by specs like the Rising Red Paladin, and then specs like Fury or Windwalker, with other specs like Frost Decay or Survival all the way at the bottom. But when you look at the raid, you do have quite some differences. Even though we still see some of the same specs still being powerful, there are quite some differences. For example, Feral Druid. Feral Druid is doing much better in Mythic Plus than they are in the raid. As an opposite, Frost Death Knight is doing much better in the raid than they are doing in Mythic Plus. You do still find some same results towards the bottom, like for example Survival is still doing quite badly in both activities. Also, Assassination Rogue is also not doing too well in both activities. So it is interesting to notice, before we start checking on the tier sets, what is the current situation of the specs and what they might need entering Season 2 to become more valuable, to become more powerful for the next season. So let's start by getting rid of the weaker of the tier sets being released in patch 10.1. The first in line is Survival Hunter. The reason why this tier set is so bad is because while actually not being too weak purely in terms of numbers, it is still weaker than the current version of the tier set that they have. Even after they buffed it, even after Blizzard buffed and gave them that second part of the 4-piece set bonus, it is still going to give them less single target damage, which is currently the strongest part of Survival, their single target. It is still going to be a nerf compared to the current tier set of survival. So survival is already very underplayed. No longer the days of old of Shadowlands Season 3. So it's underplayed, it's not very broad in the raid or in Mythic Plus, and this tier set is not going to address something that they have been missing more, like AoE damage, and it's not even going to continue to give them their same niche that they currently have, which is a very high single target damage either. So only the most niche of hipsters might be interested in playing survival in Season 2. You know, don't expect to be taken too much in consideration if you are playing a survival hunter next season. The same can be said, but not nearly as bad, for Assassination Rogue, because at the very least Assassination can also choose Subtlety or Outlaw Rogue, so they are not nearly in as bad of a situation as a survival hunter if we are talking about Melee DPS. This is quite bad overall. You do get more nature damage. Nature damage is going to bypass armor, so it's going to give you a damage increase. It's also going to give you more damage. However, the problem with this tier set is that it's going to happen after you have used your big cooldown, Deathmark. That is usually not what you want to do. Usually what you want to do is have Bloodlust, have Deathmark, have an active trinket, have a potion, and do all of your damage in that window. However, this 4-piece set bonus is going to give you this damage increase after your Deathmark has ended, so after your damage increase cooldown has ended. It's very counterintuitive. It will be like buffing a Fire Mage after Pyroblast has ended, buffing a Death Knight after Army of the Dead and Dark Transformation have ended. It's not currently playing out too well for Assassination. So if we consider that this tier set is not that great, and their current situation, which is not that great, and the fact that they are not receiving any changes in terms of balance tuning in patch 10.1, it's not looking too good for Assassination. What also, as mentioned, makes it worse is that they play in the same class of two much more popular and much stronger specs. So it's not going to be too good of a situation for Assassination either. We move up after the very bottom with another tier set which is not particularly strong, which is the one of Feral Druid. This one is quite boring in the sense that it is basically passive. So besides this change, your only hope is that the balance tuning of Feral will give you enough power to end up improving overall. Because this tier set, even in just sheer terms of numbers, in terms of how much damage it actually gives you, is not really much. It's also planned to be, at the moment, lower damage increase than your current tier set, and right now you're not particularly powerful, specifically in the raid. So Feral is not in nearly as bad of a spot, mostly because of the positive additions of the balance tuning. But if we were to just be looking at the tier set itself, then it is still quite disappointing. You know, Feral has still, for a while, continued to be the niche, the hipster type of pick for melee specs. So I don't think, even with the changes with the balance tuning, that this is going to somewhat, change the situation for patch 10.1. You're definitely not nearly as much of a troll pick as a few years ago and a few patches back. Now it's much more viable, especially for the more pug life type of players that just want to go into Mythic Plus. I think in there Feral is much more viable, and with this tier set being okay-ish and the buffs from the balance tuning, you might have a bit more of a value in Mythic Plus. You still have to beat the final boss of Feral, which is the community perception, which is the discrimination against Feral players, I'm afraid. Now, while Feral is towards the bottom in their tier set and also not doing too great right now, we do have a new entry which is definitely not in the same position, because it's Ret Paladin, still towards the bottom of power of tier sets. This tier set for Ret is simply not that great. You do get quite the stronger single target, especially in the power of the 2-piece set bonus of Ret, with more damage to Hammer of Wrath and Judgment, in particular Hammer of Wrath. The 4-piece is definitely weaker the extra damage from spenders with the reworked of Ret, they don't really do that much damage anymore, so it's not even that powerful. Hammer of Wrath applying judgment to enemies is also not even that powerful. You don't even need extra judgment debuffs on enemies. You can apply enough judgment debuffs by yourself already. So the tier set itself is actually quite weak for Ret. Ret has been reworked, now it's much stronger, but they are not really gaining much of any power, you know, to make them even stronger with this tier set. The benefit is at the moment you are already strong enough that you didn't really need a super powerful tier set to be meta, to be valuable in the next season. So if you were one of those flavor of the month rerollers trying out Ret or thinking about trying out Ret, things should still be fine in the next season, even without a super powerful tier set bonus. So that is your glass half full when looking at a disappointing tier set for Retribution Paladin. Something perhaps not nearly as much of a glass half full is for Enhancement Shaman. So we have talked about this. The problem of this tier set of Enhancement is that it's actually strong. Getting 24% mastery for 15 seconds is quite a long buff from a 2-piece set bonus, and also the damage increase you get after getting mastery, also getting more damage to your Chain Lightning, 100% more Chain Lightning damage, as well as Maelstrom refunds of that. It's actually quite strong AoE damage for Enhancement. Now, considering the strongest point, the strongest position of Enhancement is in Mythic Plus, is in, you know, AoE damage, trash packs in Mythic Plus, so this one makes you even stronger in where you are strong already. The problem is sort of the annoyance on the fact that this whole set is enabled by Sundering. Now, you already take Sundering in your talents, so it's not that big of a problem to take it. The problem is that Sundering is quite the good crowd control. Sundering is quite the good disorient, which you can use to stop casts, to stop uninterruptible casts, for example, and now this is now tied to a damage cooldown. It's now tied to essentially burst damage. So basically now you have to stop using Sundering as a crowd control ability because you now have to use it for damage with your tier set. That is the only disappointing part of this tier set for Enhancement. Of course, it's not very disappointing in the raid because you don't care too much about crowd control, but then again, in the raid it is quite weak since the AoE part, the Chain Lightning damage part in the raid is of course much less valuable due to most of the time having many boss fights with just single target damage, so the damage increase of your Chain Lightning is not nearly as important. But Enhancement has grown enough recently. It has become much more valuable in Mythic Plus. It's one of the top picks in Mythic Plus, and it is always, despite their damage not really being up to par in the raid, it's still a quite wanted spec, at least one of it, for Windfury, right? For giving Windfury buff to other melee specs. So with a spot, perhaps not guaranteed, perhaps not secured, but definitely encouraged in the raid out of Windfury, and your position still being quite strong in Mythic Plus, then it's still a quite decent pick for Season 2 as a spec. Enhancement is. So with this tier set being a little bit annoying but still not weak per se in the next season, it will still be a decent choice to go in Season 2 looking for an Enhancement Shaman. Now we rise a little bit above the bottom half with Unholy Death Knight. Its tier set has been buffed. Now it's much more manageable to use compared to its first iteration because the whole damage buff of the tier set is now enabled by yourself, enabled by using Dark Transformation. Before, this buff would proc by itself once you got 20 stacks. But the problem was still that you could not use this on pull because you did not have 20 stacks to gain the massive buff. So the 4-piece set bonus change, which makes it so that using Army of the Dead instantly grants you 20 stacks of this buff, is now much better to use for Unholy, because now on pull, for example on bosses or on big Mythic Plus pulls, you can now instantly use Army of the Dead and instantly benefit from the tier set bonus. bonus. So the quality of life has definitely improved for Death Knight and has made the spec much better with this tier set compared to the first iteration of this tier set bonus. Now, Unholy is not that popular by itself right now. It's not very strong at the moment in Mythic Plus. It is much more viable, so to speak, in the raid. It's somewhat an unfortunate situation if you are a Death Knight player because you have two specs and both specs are better in the raid than they are in Mythic Plus. You might have preferred having Unholy specialized for top Mythic Plus specs and then Frost for top raiding, but unfortunately both of them are not particularly great in Mythic Plus, so definitely if you were looking into playing Death Knight, it looks like for the moment you would have to be more of a raid type of guy compared to being more of a Mythic Plus type of guy. We do have, at the very least, for another class, something a bit different, because for Warrior, we do have a bit of a change, because Arms, the tier set of Arms, despite being nerfed, is still quite okay. The 2-piece set bonus was basically nerfed in half, which definitely made it weaker, but more importantly, the 4-piece set bonus was changed so that now it works with Mortal Strike. Previously, it worked with Slam. Arms Warriors don't want to use Slam. They are already GCD crowded. They didn't want to add another ability to their rotation, so now it has been made much easier, much more fluid to use compared to before. It's not particularly good, mostly because the 4-piece works off of critting with deep wounds and you don't go for crit as an Arms Warrior that much, you go much more for haste, so your critting of deep wounds is not gonna happen that often to make the 4-piece set bonus work a lot. And it's not that Mortal Strike is going to be your top damage ability anyway, so overall, the set itself, in particular the 4-piece, is not that strong. What was really strong was your 2-piece set bonus, which is now being nerfed, as mentioned, by 50%. The power of being an Arms Warrior is that right now you are one of the strongest picks in the raid. You are much weaker, not nearly as strong in Mythic Plus, but at the very least you have, as we have talked about, you have an opposite. You have Fury, which is the opposite, being weaker in the raid but much stronger in Mythic Plus. So unlike DK, who has 2 specs stronger in the same activity, Warrior at the very least can somewhat choose which one of the two to go for. So definitely, again, if you were thinking and looking into playing Arms, that's definitely for now more of a raid, sort of raid specific type of spec. Not nearly as much room for Arms in Mythic Plus right now. We do have something now towards the actual top of the food chain, which is Windwalker Monk. So we looked at one of the first specs being quite highly rated right now, which was Ret. Now we have Windwalker. Now, the tier set of Windwalker is not terrible, it's also not very good overall, but it has been made better. It was changed by Blizzard so that now the 2-piece set bonus is slightly better in how it works. It's still not great because you don't want to use Rising Sun Kick in AoE anyways, so the Shadow Flame AoE damage you do with Rising Sun Kick is somewhat counterintuitive because you weren't going to use Rising Sun Kick in AoE anyways, but at least the 12% more damage on Rising Sun Kick is still welcome. The 4-piece set bonus also changed. It's better than before, it does more damage overall, but it's still quite boring. It's still quite working, you know, in the background by itself. The power at the moment for Windwalker is that it's a viable and quite high up, you know, quite wanted spec in Mythic Plus, and also quite the strong spec in the raid. What is also even more valuable for Windwalker is that at the moment Mistweaver is very unpopular, underplayed in the raid, and so is Brewmaster, which means you need your Monk debuff in the raid, your physical damage debuff in the raid. So Windwalker, being the strongest of the 3 Monk specs, usually gets a comfy, safe raid spot as the one that will bring the debuff. So having a comfy spot in the raid, plus being strong in Mythic Plus, and having a decent-ish tier set makes you quite the good, quite the safe spec going into Season 2. as a melee DPS. We are definitely no longer in the phase when Windwalker was much more of a niche, much more of an underplayed spec. Now it's much more normal to see Windwalkers running around, so definitely a somewhat safe pick for the next season. Now, talking about one of the safest of picks and also in the middle of the pack of tier set power is Havoc Demon Hunter. So the Demon Hunter has a mediocre tier set. It's not really building on what they already do with their build right now in both Raid and Mythic Plus. It has been changed slightly, so now it's actually stronger than what it was before, especially the 2-piece set bonus. So you get this agility increase buff quite often, quite with a high uptime, because you will be spending quite a lot of Fury over time, so proccing Seeding Fury will be quite valuable. The 4-piece set bonus is not nearly as powerful as mentioned. Your I-beam damage has gone down a lot recently with your different builds, so it's not as powerful as before with your Cycle of Hatred, you know, perma I-beam build style of Havoc. Now it's no longer that, but it's still valuable, perhaps off of the 2-piece alone, and as mentioned, you already are an S tier spec. You are one of the strongest, one of the most broad specs in Mythic Plus, and simultaneously also in the raid. So you didn't even need a super powerful tier set right now to be a flavor of the month, a meta spec in Season 2. So you didn't need one anyways. You have gotten one that is somewhat decent. It shouldn't really change your situation for the next season. So if you were thinking about playing, thinking about dabbing a little bit more into Havoc Demon Hunter, you should be very, very safe in knowing that you will have room to play in Season 2. Of course, also worth mentioning, just like for Monk, is that the other spec of Demon Hunter in Vengeance is very, very underplayed in the raid. Barely anyone plays tank in the raid as Vengeance, which means, of course, that now the debuff, the magical damage debuff brought by a Demon Hunter will be in a Havoc. So even if you weren't strong, even if you weren't one of the best in the raid, which you are right now, you would have still been brought for the magical damage debuff anyways. So that's your life on easy mode right now for an Havoc Demon Hunter. Now we enter towards the top 4 spots, starting with Subtlety Rogue. So Subtlety is in a similar, perhaps not nearly as strong of a situation as Havoc, but at the very least their tier set is stronger. They build on their Shadow Dance and the buff of Symbols of Death with this tier set. This is slightly better than, for example, a tier set that we mentioned with Arms, because in this case, while the tier set of Arms works off of crit, but they don't build crit as their main stat, for Subtlety they do. So the 4-piece set bonus giving them 15% more crit damage with one of their more damaging abilities, Eviscerate, is actually quite viable because Subtlety Rogues do go for crit, do focus crit, so they can get a lot of value from this 4-piece set bonus. The 2-piece, it's mostly quality of life, extending the duration of dots and giving you a free 10 seconds of Symbols of Death, giving you more uptime of Symbols of Death is also quite nice for a Subtlety Rogue. So much like a Havoc Demon Hunter, you already are one of the strongest and most broad specs in Mythic Plus. You already are one of the stronger and most broad specs in terms of performance in the raid as well, and now your tier set is also quite nice. So, once again, smooth sailing if you were thinking about playing a rogue, and in particular playing a Subtlety Rogue. Now, here, however, we have to interrupt the smooth sailing for something a little bit more dangerous, because we're talking about Fury Warrior. So, the tier set of Fury Warrior is quite strong. The 2-piece set bonus by itself already is quite nice. You already use Rampage quite a lot, so getting a flat buff to the damage of Rampage is more than nice. The 4-piece set bonus also synergizes your Rampage with your Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst was an ability that sort of lost out its value in the newest version of Fury, and this 4-piece set bonus, given the scope, given the size of the buffs given to Bloodthirst, 10% increase critical strike chance, 25% more damage, and 2 additional rage stacking up, makes it much more powerful overall for Fury Warrior. It also changes your rotation. It's one of the few tier sets that can add something new to your rotation, because now you're going to introduce again Bloodthirst into your rotation much more often as a Fury Warrior. So it's definitely a powerful one. I said it's a bit more dangerous compared to Subtlety and Havoc, because unlike them, Fury is not S tier, is not super strong in any activity. They do have quite a strong power, quite a strong value right now in Mythic Plus, but not nearly as meta as the meta specs, and they are also weaker in the raid. In particular, weaker than arms. So my suggestion as a Fury Warrior enjoyer might be thinking about playing in Season 2 is if you can dual wield, if you can dual play, the Warrior DPS specs would probably be better, because at the moment arms seems to be much stronger in the raid, to the point where nobody would see why you would want to play Fury over arms in a raid, and then the opposite is also true in Mythic Plus. Fury is better than arms, so if you could play both specs as a warrior, it would be quite great for Season 2. If you are more stubborn and you only want to play Fury, then perhaps your chance to get into more raiding might be a little bit tougher compared to the current power of Arms Warrior. But it's definitely not too bad of a situation for Fury right now. Talking about not too bad of a situation, we have a little bit of a confusing situation for Frost Death Knight. So the tier set of Frost has been buffed the same way the tier set of Unholy was reworked. Now your randomly proccing Frostworm's Fury is enabled instead by you, by pressing Pillar of Frost. So you have much more control on when you actually spawn your Frostworm's Fury. You also do have some freebie, some 20% more damage to Howling Blast, as well as giving you 25% more damage from crit strikes with your 4-piece set bonus. So it has been made much stronger compared to its previous iteration, which gives you a welcome boost of power as Frost. I'm mentioning the part about being confusing because Frost right now is okay. Actually, I would say it's good in the raid. It has decent power in the raid, but it is much weaker, downright dreadful in Mythic Plus. So it's again one of those raid focused specs if you were eyeing towards playing Frost Death Knight. It's definitely much more of a solid choice if you want to raid and don't put nearly as much importance in going in Mythic Plus overall. The last of the specs. Finally, we got here. It's also the last of the specs with the strongest tier set, even after being nerfed. This is Outlaw Rogue. So both of the 2-piece and the 4-piece set bonuses of Outlaw are very strong. Even just the agility, the 5%, the nerfed agility bonus of the 4-piece is very strong, considering the massive duration, 15 seconds, as well as currently the soul rip damage mechanic of the tier set bonus is very strong. So nothing really much to say, because most of this is just passive. It's just in the background. It's not really going to be changing much of anything for you when you play. It's just a lot of continued damage for Outlaw. So the thing for Outlaw is that they are decent to strong in Mythic Plus and not nearly as strong in the raid. Easily below Subtlety. So the situation for Outlaw is perhaps somewhat of a reversed situation of Frost. You are more focused on Mythic Plus than you would be in the raid. And also, much like Warriors, you would be better off if you were willing to play multiple specs of Rogue. So playing both Outlaw and Subtlety at the same time, for example, would allow you to be an S tier spec in the raid by playing Subtlety, and a very high tier spec in Mythic Plus by playing Outlaw, although technically Subtlety is also a high tier spec in Mythic Plus. But in the case of wanting to play Outlaw, that's how you would be, trying to focus a little bit more on Mythic Plus, because that's where you are strongest right now as a spec. So coming in Season 2, there might be some interesting changes given the powerful tier sets of some of the specs, in particular the one to Outlaw, whether or not it might match the power of Subtlety, the tier set given to Fury Warrior, for example, the one given to Subtlety, if it might change something, or maybe the opposite, maybe a powerful spec right now, like Ret, not receiving a powerful tier set, if that might change something in the next season. So that is what we have left to wait for in Season 2, and these were the more or less rough recommendations of what you might be interested in playing for Season 2, based on what you might be interested in doing, whether or not it's more raid focused or whether or not it's more Mythic Plus focused. With this entire way too long video out of the way, we can now actually leave each other, as I have to cut this short because this is not a movie. So thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the patrons for the contribution and the help to the growth of this channel. You can, of course, still support completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Further ways to support would be following me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So, down with these things out of the way. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, my biggest hopium take for the Melee DPS would actually be Feral Druid. That's right, I have my stocks on Feral not being an absolute joke next season.